And then you can look at these compost calculators that give you ideas of multiply the area by the depth, and it'll tell you how many cubic meters you need. And I did that for this area actually, because this area is roughly the size of a whole allotment in the UK, 1/16 of an acre, so about 250 square meters. And the compost calculation came out, it came out at 4 cubic meters, and that works out at about 3 tons. And I thought, I'm not using that much. And of course, if I rework that, what I need to allow for is that you're not spreading compost on the whole area. So if you look at how, here for example, we have a bed with compost, and then there's a gap by the side. Actually, I would have put a bit more, and I had a guy doing this. I'd normally go to about there, because I know that birds are going to kick it down a bit and that kind of thing. But there's nearly always, we leave a gap between the edge of the bed, if you like, and the path. You can see we put some wood chip recently on the path. The path is not hugely wide. Then you've got another little gap before you've got compost on the asparagus. So it's maybe 2/3 of the area has compost on. So if you use these compost calculators, allow for the paths which are not receiving compost. We're using wood chip. This is 6-month-old wood chip on average. So you can see it's slightly decomposed already. And you could say that that's a kind of compost. It's like, what is compost? Compost is anything decomposed. Actually, that leads on to the next question, but I'll just quickly finish by saying that for using these calculations for a full-size allotment, I reckon you need around 3 cubic meters, which in terms of tons is less. It's about 2.4 tons. That's my calculation based on experience of actually doing the compost spreading. So let's go and have a look at now some different types of compost, because that's the next question is actually, what does well rotted mean, or well decomposed? So here we have some examples of compost that's well decomposed and compost which is less well decomposed. For example, this is homemade compost here from Homemakers My Garden, which was made last December mainly, between November and April, but most of the ingredients went in November, December actually. And so we could say this is a year-old compost. You can see that's pretty nice, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So like, you've got bits of wood in there, there's all sorts of few stems. We aim to cut stems not too long so that they're still quite short, but I do not mind at all seeing bits of still yet to finish decomposing material in here, because that's spread on the surface. That's food for, again, food for life in the soil, and bits of woody material in particular are food for the fungal network in soil, so they're valuable actually. So that for me would be perfect. This may be a little less perfect. It's actually some green waste compost, which looks beautiful. You can see how black and soft it is. It's actually a year since they delivered it, and that makes it better, because often when this kind of stuff, compost you buy, is delivered, it can be too hot. Hot, fresh, burns, those words are all kind of synonymous. And steaming compost, you could spread it as a thin layer, and things will then eat it eventually. But it's going to take a bit of goodness out of the soil while it finishes its own decomposing. So older green waste compost like this, actually, I'm very happy. It's getting life back in it. It doesn't have a lot when it's delivered, and that has a lot of life, I reckon, microbes. And then I went to my neighbour's yard earlier this morning, just because I wanted to show you some less well decomposed, because it's another thing that causes concern. For example, this is actually fresh manure. And when we talk about manure, what do we mean? The word traditionally, manure, includes the bedding, which is this. It's mixed with a bit of horse poo and a bit of horse urine probably. It's quite damp, but that's literally from last night. So it's very fresh. Actually smells quite sweet. Horse manure is not offensive smell in my eyes. And this is what I think some people think of as manure, which is literally the manure, the horse poo of last night. You can see there's still grass fibres in there. And generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend using that as a compost dressing. It's not really, well, it's not compost. But if you had nothing else, then as a soil food, if you like, food for organisms in a thin layer, that would be better than nothing. but I wouldn't call it compost. And one thing it will have is weed seeds, because it hasn't got hot. And the hay, this is hay. I brought a bit back to show you as well, because there's, if you've never lived in the countryside or worked on a farm, you wouldn't necessarily know the difference between hay and straw. So this was some of the other manure from her yard, and that's straw. So they've used straw as a bedding. Straw is not an animal food as much as hay is. Hay is just dry grass, and straw is the stem, or was the stem of, say, wheat and barley growing, which have been harvested and then the grain taken out, and the straw remains the stem, which is baled up, and that's used for bedding. And that also is from manure, which is just a day old. And it's this hay which is causing a lot of the problems for gardeners at the moment, because it has this pyralid weed killer, or can have this pyralid weed killer in the stuff that never breaks down, basically. Do check out my video on that. I'll give you some information. It's just something to be aware of. And while I was at Jenny's, I also brought this back. I found this behind her heap of manure, and this is probably a good year old horse manure. So that's horse manure, and that's horse manure, and this is where the words can be confusing. That's fresh manure. This is well decomposed horse manure, which is basically now compost. You know, this I would use like compost. One would still call it manure because that's identifying its origin.